Welcome to A Reader's Paradise for book lovers, audiobook listeners, writers, and for everyone who loves a great story. Hello, and welcome to another edition of A Reader's Paradise. You know, I enjoy reading, and one of my most favorite people to enjoy a book with is my friend Amy. And Amy has made some wonderful recommendations to me to read as far as literary books. And we enjoy sharing a good read and discussing a book. And so today we have the Reader's Paradise bookshelf where Amy and I are going to talk about some of the books we've read and some of the books we've enjoyed for you, the listeners, to also enjoy. Amy, take a moment to say hello to the listeners.
Hello, podcast listeners.
It's so wonderful to have you here, Amy. So what is the first book that you have for us to enjoy today?
Are we talking fiction or nonfiction?
Let's talk nonfiction. What is a good nonfiction book? I know it's going to be one that you've recommended to me, but what's a good nonfiction book that you can share with the readers?
One of my favorite nonfiction books has to be the one by Viktor Frankl, and we read this book together a couple of years ago, and it was his memoir entitled "A Man's Search for Meaning."
And can you give us a little bit more about A Man's Search for Meaning? Although I know the book, but I want our listeners to really get the sense of what this book is about.
Wow, it really did speak to how, as humans, the long suffering that we may have to endure and what we need to do to get through those dark times in our lives. He was obviously in a Nazi concentration camp and had to watch and to endure a lot of suffering.
Yeah. One of the things that we discussed when we talked about this book, although it was, about World War II and suffering, but we really talked about how suffering is just this human condition that we just cannot get around. I mean, we brought it back up to today's standards, today's society, and we talked about no matter how poor you may be or how wealthy you may be, suffering is just unavoidable. Life is just going to come at you no matter what.
Exactly. Suffering doesn't have a zip code. It will show up on your street at some given point. And Viktor Frankl does hit on that. He says it's unavoidable. Unavoidable suffering is what we're going to have to learn to deal with. And he really tapped into this psychotherapy process of being able to visualize and find hope and meaning and dealing with that suffering.
It's funny because one of the things that ended up happening in the story is that Viktor said that when he was in the concentration camp, he could tell when someone's going to die because they gave up. And he says that, part of man's search for meaning is to have purpose. Would you agree with that? Oh,
truly. I mean, when he was talking about other Nazi concentration camp victims, he did reference the fact that they no longer had hope. You could see it in their eyes. But he seemed, I think with the way that his mind was working, in order for him to endure, he had to imagine himself being really on the other side. Mm-hmm. And that gave him the hope. But he saw, his family members perish in these concentration camps. So for him, he really, like a lot of people could have given up. There was no hope, but he found it within himself to keep pressing on. And for me, this has been one of the books that I have referenced quite a bit, just with friends and families in regards to what has made a significant impact on me.
Yeah, because that's one of the ways that, listeners and readers find out about books. It's generally it generally comes through a recommendation, because that's how books really get popular, is through recommendations. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important that when we do as podcasters and as readers, that we recommend really good books to people. And with that being said, you've recommended a wonderful nonfiction book. Thank you very much for recommending that nonfiction book. Now, let's go over to the other side and let's talk about fiction. What is a really good fiction book that you would recommend?
Ooh. Well, we've read so many books together and we've had a chance to share so many different titles. But one author that stood out to me, who unfortunately only wrote one book, was Deloris Phillips, and the title of her book was called The Darkest Child.
Oh yeah, I remember The Darkest Child. Oh yeah, because what was the name of the main character? Pearl. The oh my God! And by the way, I happened to listen to the audiobook narration of The Darkest Child, and the narrator that did the job on that book was just absolutely fantastic. I mean, she really understood this book and these characters. So tell us a little bit more about the book.
Oh, wow. It was about a woman who had to rear her children on her own. It was set in the South. It's historical fiction. And it really did talk about the mental psychosis that this mother went through, and how that transferred over to her kids. Just the level of abuse that she forced upon them on a daily. The psychological, the physical, the emotional.
What psychologists would call that is intergenerational transfer of emotional trauma.
Yes.
Yeah. So what this character did is what you're driving at is that she had a lot of emotional. The mother, the main protagonist,
yes,
had a lot of emotional baggage and trauma from her own childhood, and in her adulthood, unwittingly, unknowingly, or whatever the case may be, she transferred this sort of trauma that was unresolved, unhealed, onto her children. And why was the book called The Darkest Child?
She had like a rainbow coalition of children.
A rainbow coalition of children. Can you explain what the rainbow coalition of children is?
Well, she found herself having to figure out ways to provide for her number of children that she was having these, kid after kid after kid, but she was having them with so many different men, and they all were like a spectrum of color.
Okay.
So it's almost as if none of the kids had the same father. That's why I call it the Rainbow Coalition, because, one was really very fair to one was being very dark. So there was this kind of this sort of as you say, spectrum or variety of children who were sired by different men. Okay, so we won't give any more away from that book from that book, but the book is called The Darkest Child by Deloris Phillips, and I highly recommend that you pick it up and read it. It's a book that will most certainly have you saying, "Oh my God, what's going to happen next?" And it will also make you think about your own inner family dynamics and perhaps some of the transference of past baggage or emotional trauma that may have be happening in your own family. It's really a book that sparks conversation. Well, one of the I think the main character was outside of the mother was the one child that they called the darkest child was Tangi.
Tangi, yes.
Tangi was the darkest of her 10 kids, and she considered her to be the ugliest.
Oh, and that opens up a whole nother bag of social, emotional things when it comes to people of color. And that's just not people in America who are African American. That is people of color around the globe, where sometimes people think the darker your skin is, the more unattractive or devalued you are, and that is just not true.
Yes.
And so it touches on that, and that even opens up
a whole new set of emotional wounds for African American, especially I think women of color. Because society has given this, image that the lighter you are, the more beautiful you are, versus that you're dark, you're not perceived or looked at or viewed as being beautiful or attractive in any form or fashion. And it's one of those books where you wouldn't think that a parent could do that to their own children.
But you know what? It's funny because we at one point we may have thought that parents wouldn't do that to children, but in this social media world where we have cameras in our cell phones, we see the world a bit differently than in past generations, because now we have access to much more of the interworkings of people's lives than we ever had in the past.
Well, and we talk about the trauma that these kids have faced under their mom, Roselle.
Roselle Quinn. You can't
Roselle
forget.
Quinn,
you can't forget that name.
So,
Roselle Quinn.
So we talk about the experiences they had to face on a daily, growing up in that household, because she was a tormented soul, and she truly transferred that onto her children. But then that brings us to a book that we both loved, and we talked about ad nauseum, probably for a lot of people, was A Deepest Well.
The Deepest Well by Dr. Nadine Burke Harris.
Yes.
Yes, we talked about that book at length. This is a nonfiction book.
Yes.
It's a nonfiction book by a California doctor, I believe it is, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris.
Yep.
And she wrote a book called The Deepest Well. And let me tell you, it is a transformative book. I don't know about for you, but it was a very transformative book for me.
It was very enlightening because sometimes we think that what we're experiencing, whether, think about childhood diseases you may have or illnesses that you may have, and you're thinking like, okay, I have eczema, or I may have been diagnosed with ADHD, and you just think, okay, well, that is what it is.
Or you may think that since my mom had it or somebody else had it, that I have it.
But one of the things that she reveals in her studies is that it's beyond just having the symptoms, the physical symptoms of ADHD or eczema or asthma. She went to the root cause, and that's what I really enjoyed reading about her book. And that's when she started talking about the ACE scores.
The ACE scores, the adverse childhood experiences. And what she really talks about is she talks about the brain a little bit.
Yes.
And she talks about this thing called the amygdala in the brain, which is your fight, flight, or freeze center. And the amygdala is responsible for releasing cortisol, which is also known as the stress hormone. Yeah. And the stress hormone, when it floods the body, it shuts down all other non-essential functions, including your ability to think. Yeah, including your ability to think, because this mechanism is there just to save your life. To save your life. So one of the interesting things that I know that you brought up before is that in the book, The Deepest Well, that there was a parent who came in that said their child was uncontrollable and just put him on medication. Right.
That the parent was referencing, and this was a inner city community that this child lived in a household with their mother and father. And the teachers from that particular school had indicated that this child was displaying behaviors of ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And so the mom goes to the doctor, to Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, and says, hey, these are my child's symptoms, just put him on medication. But the doctor, thank God for her, said, hey, we need to look deeper than this. And so she developed this kind of a questionnaire. And based off of that, I think it was 10 questions. And if you scored a certain number, it showed you had a very high ACE score, which references adverse childhood experiences. And this particular young boy had a very high ACE score. And then she started talking about how looking at the external factors as well as those internal factors of the home to see what would be the triggers for this child and why was he displaying those particular behaviors that truly do manifest themselves as ADHD in this particular child. And so they were talking about the bear in the house.
Yes, the bear in the house. And what she was talking about with the bear in the house is, like, as I was referencing before, the amygdala, your fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. It's like, imagine that you had to walk to school every day and you had to fight a bully. That amygdala is going to release the stress hormone, for you to protect yourself. And usually that stress, that part of the brain has a cutoff switch.
Yes.
That, okay, when the threat is gone, the cortisol shuts off and the body goes back to normal. But with kids with high ACE scores, that amygdala gets out of whack and it doesn't know when to shut off, especially if you have a bully living in the same house as you do. Because now you're going home and you don't know what's
going to trigger that bully to all of a sudden lose it. And then you find yourself, you're always kind of like hyper aware to the point that you don't even know how to shut yourself down when there are situations that don't require you to be hyper aware.
Right.
Because you're thinking you always have to be in a defensive mode.
Right.
A protective mode, I guess, for that particular child.
Right. The other thing that I want to say about this book that brought to both of our attentions is that Dr. Nadine Burke Harris says, doctors are trained to just do a baseline sort of treatment. If you come in with this particular problem, prescribe this particular pill, and they really don't have the time to deal with all the other external factors that may be triggering your high blood pressure, your hypertension, your diabetes, your digestion problems, or your anxiety. They're just there, they're good for setting a broken bone, but they're not necessarily there to deal with all of these other external factors that may be triggering these things. So it makes you become aware that when you go to your practitioner, that, you have to keep in mind they're there to treat the symptoms and not necessarily get to the cause. And you as an individual, it's up to you to try to figure out some of those causes and do some of the work for that.
I agree.
You agree?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it has been a fun podcast talking with you, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on your podcast.
And until next time, everybody, happy reading.